Before we go any further in our study of the mendicant orders, before we leave the Franciscans too far behind, I need to show off my Francis of Assisi bobblehead. You may not know that I am a collector of bobbleheads. I forgot to show you my bobblehead of Patrick of Ireland, but this is my bobblehead of Francis of Assisi. Most of my bobbleheads are from the Reformation era or later, but nonetheless, here is Francis of Assisi, and so I'm glad to show him off to you. All right, well, let's move on to the next major mendicant leader, and that is Dominic de Guzman, who founded the Dominicans. You see his life dates there in the late 12th, early 13th century. Dominic was born in Castile, Spain, to a pious family. The story is told that before his birth, his mother dreamed that within her womb was a dog who ran bearing a torch that set the world on fire. Possibly she had a few too many jalapenos in her enchiladas and got the baby to kicking. But at any rate, this story gave birth to the idea of the Lord's hounds, Domini canes, okay? In Latin, the hounds of the Lord. And so the Dominicanes is a pun on the name of the Dominicans, the followers of Dominic. Now, Dominic lived a life of study and prayer and personal deprivation. He slept on bare earth. It's said that his only luxury was books, but even those he sold for the sake of charity. Remember that books at that time were made of sheepskins, and so he said, I could not bear to prize dead skins when living skins were starving and in want. Dominic was a prior of the Austin canons. That means he was second in command, and he went on a mission to southern France, attempting to convert the heretics there through persuasion and through his example of personal deprivation. So notice that he wanted to persuade the heretics, not coerce them. And he felt that he could do this by demonstrating his own personal devotion through deprivation, doing without the bodily comforts and even necessities. So he led an ascetic life, as we have already observed. And he developed followers, an order of preachers who were trained in theology to combat heresy. And in 1220, Pope Honorius III recognized this new order as the Order of Preachers. And so often you'll see books written by a Dominican, and in parenthesis after his name will be these letters OP. That tells you that he's a member of the Order of Preachers or a Dominican. Remember, the Franciscans were known as the Friars Minor. So, mendicant orders relied on begging, at least initially, and that helped them identify with the masses. They were devoted to practical ministries like preaching, teaching, and missions. They were active in society instead of withdrawing to monasteries. They were subject to the Pope, not to secular authorities. This is because they, at least at first, did not have land for monasteries, and so they were not obliged to nobles for their gifts. Instead, they were subject to the Pope. And as I said, they developed tertiaries. These were the third level of orders for lay people after men and women. They had tertiaries, were those who partook in religious ministries without taking vows of celibacy or poverty. Remember, Catherine of Siena was a Dominican tertiary. We just talked about Raymond Lull, who was a Franciscan tertiary. As we will see, Franciscans and Dominicans staffed the new universities. They led in the scholastic movement, which we will be talking about next. But also they participated in the Inquisitions, which is a less savory aspect of their later ministry. So let's talk about heresy and the Inquisition. The background to the Inquisition is the union of church and state. Remember that the citizen of the state was a member of the church. When a child was born, that child was baptized in the church and then enrolled in the state. And so citizenship in the state, membership in the church, they were one and the same. And so heretics, anyone who did not conform to the ideals, the standards, the doctrines of the church, must be forced to conform. They were a danger to society. And so conformity was necessary for the sake of the church. Doctrinal purity and uniformity must be maintained, and dissenters must be punished or purged off the church rolls. All right, conformity was necessary for the sake of the individual. Since there is no salvation outside the church, anyone dissenting from the church must recant in order to be saved. And also, conformity was necessary to prevent the heretics from influencing others. And then heretics must be forced to conform for the sake of the state. Because remember, religious uniformity was essential to the stability of the state. Okay, this has always been an essential part of the church-state union. And so dissent was viewed as treason. If you dissent from the church, you are a traitor to the state. And so heretics must be forced to conform. How did that take place? Well, through the Inquisition, as we will find out. But let's talk about the major heresy in Europe at this time. They were the Albigensians, also known as the Cathari. In southern France, these heretics settled in Albi, hence they were named Albigensians, those who come from Albi. In Germany, they were known as the Cathari, or the pure ones. In their beliefs, some of them we would agree with. They were opposed to infant baptism. They were opposed to the veneration of Mary. They were opposed to the cult of saints and the worship of icons. All right. So far, we agree with them. And so they had serious problems with many of the doctrines and practices of the established Catholic Church. But they held to adoptionism, which, as you will recall, is a heretical doctrine of Christ. We said that he was fully human, adopted by the Holy Spirit at baptism, but not fully divine. They came under the influence of the Manichees. You'll remember Manichaeism, this dualistic religion where light and dark are equal forces. The Manichees were an ascetic group, particularly those who were called the perfects or the elite, and those who followed Manichaeism were saved by obedience to these elite Manichees, and they must receive sacraments from them. All right, so truly the Albigensians or the Cathari, by whatever name, they truly were heretics. But Dominic had it right. His goal was to persuade the heretics to return to the true Christian doctrine. But the popes, the bishops, the state leaders, they were impatient and wanted to force these heretics to conform, and therefore they established the Inquisitions. All right, the Inquisitions were the investigations of heresy and schism by the church, but the punishment was by the state. All right, so the trials were conducted by the church, but then the offenders were handed over to the state for punishment. The goal was to rid Christian society of internal threats. All right, we have to maintain the unity of the state, and so any dissent from within must be removed. The Inquisitions were used to enforce conformity and to suppress religious dissent. Okay, it has ever been thus from the very beginning of the Constantinian symbiosis. The church called upon the resources of the state to enforce conformity and suppress dissent. So the Inquisitions started in 1179 when Alexander III, remember one of the bad popes, all right, he sent a crusade against the Albigensians. He promised crusaders the same promises of indulgences if they would take their crusade and attack the Albigensians in southern France. Many of the Albigensians were slaughtered, but survivors continued in their religion. In 1209, Innocent III sent a crusade that destroyed entire cities. And then in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Innocent established regulations for bishops to seek out heresy. Then in 1233, Pope Gregory IX organized a purge under papal inquisitors. All right, if you're a Star Wars fan, you know about inquisitors, but these are medieval religious authorities that seek out heresy and punish it. And these inquisitors were Dominicans and Franciscans, and so these mendicant orders, these humble beggars, these preachers who began by persuasion, ended up resorting to coercion to bring heretics back into the fold. 1252, Pope Innocent IV allowed the use of torture. Penalties included confiscation of goods, imprisonment, and burning at the stake. And in 1262, Urban IV created the office of Inquisitor General. All right, so the popes lead the way in establishing the Inquisitions and calling upon Dominicans and Franciscans to take the lead in these actions. Now, the Spanish Inquisition was by far the most stringent. In the late 15th century, this united the effort of church and state under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, very well known as the sponsors of Christopher Columbus. All right, but they were devout Catholics and opposed to any heresy or any other religion. They're opposed to Judaism, to Islam, and of course remember Islam had been dominant in Spain under the Moors' leadership, but of course they were pushed out eventually. But nonetheless, the Moors who remained behind were forced to convert to Christianity. Jews were forced to convert, and any thought of recanting the Christian faith was met with the Inquisition. So, aimed at lapsed Jewish and Muslim Christians as well as Protestants. And I will say that the Protestant Reformation made no inroads at all into Spain. Elsewhere in Europe, they had great success, but not at all in Spain. And the Spanish Inquisition continued until 1808. That's hard to realize that it lasted so late into the really even into the modern era. All right, so the Inquisition. The effects of the Inquisition were to revive pagan cruelty and torture in the church, reminiscent of what the Romans had done, what the Roman pagans had done to the Christians. Now, the Catholic Christians are doing to anyone that they perceived as heretical. The Inquisition promoted avarice and vengeance because the spoils of the alleged heretics' estates were divided among the inquisitors, the city, and the bishop. I'm going to recommend a book called Captain from Castile. It's written by Samuel Shellabarger, who's one of my favorite authors. I'm telling you, I recommend Samuel Shellabarger all the time. I don't know anybody who's ever read any of his books based on my recommendation, but he did a wonderful job of historical romantic fiction. And Captain from Castile talks about a family who came under attack by the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor had coveted the father's vineyard, and when the father refused to sell it to him, then he simply accused him of heresy. They were all imprisoned, and the Inquisitor seized the land. Okay? And then the rest of the story is how the son gains vengeance against the Inquisitor, and it involves a trip to the New World under Hernando Cortez. All right, so I recommend it, Captain from Castile, just a bit of fun, romantic reading. But nonetheless, it proves the point, it illustrates the point that the inquisitors could make these accusations even without basis, and as a result, they could take the estates of those who were accused. All right, it stimulated dissent throughout Europe because you cannot force faith. All right, and so all across Europe there is dissent against the Catholic Church. It destroyed thousands of evangelicals and brought disrepute upon the Roman Catholic Church. And it indirectly contributed to the Reformation. You have already seen this theme begin in the history of the bad popes, as papal corruption and abuse leads to a call for reformation. The Inquisition will lead to more calls for the Reformation. As we continue through this unit, we'll see over and over again how Catholic corruption and misuse of their authority and power will lead to the necessity of the Reformation. And then, of course, we're going to close this unit with the dawn of the Reformation, but we still have several lectures to get through before we get there. So thank you for hanging in with me so far, and we will proceed when we meet again. Thank you.